Good morning. The welcome to the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen on Fresh FM. So, today we're going to carry on the second of a part three series I've done on the protests, or the parliamentary protests. The first week, what I did was I actually brought, or the week before last, I brought in my niece, who's a communications and a student up in Wellington, and we did a little bit of a show, which was just basically looking at how people on both sides were in some parts disconnected in very varieties of ways. And I brought Ruby on to the show. A, because she lives locally, and B, I wanted to make sure that it was someone who had a distance and a different perspective from me, to make sure I was giving you a balanced coverage, so that basically making sure that I wasn't too close to the story. Which today we're going to start with part one about my journey to Wellington, which in some ways actually begins in 2021, when I started to participate, first of all, in the protests against the mandates in Invercargill. And I went along, first of all, I went along to basically to cover the event and see how it would be covered by the local media. Now, number one was I wasn't very keen to go to begin with, because I had in my mind, from what I'd read in the newspapers and seen on, on the media, that the people that were opposing the protests were basically likely to be Donald Trump types, and they'd be flying Confederate flags, and they'd be out white and racist and homophobic, and basically all things and people that I really can't personally abide. I, however, went along for a couple of reasons. One was that one of my friends, who is he's a mariner. He basically takes care of the Maui gas fields virtually single-handedly. A man who's got great ability to understand information technically, who had decided that he wasn't happy with the mRNA component in the Pfizer vaccine. This is basically what we're calling the nano particles, which has actually got a name like BNT, da 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 da. And he went, bugger that, I'm not putting that in my body. I'll hang out until the Novavax comes along. And so this is the man that, whose salary's worth about $250,000 a year, decided it wasn't worth the risk for him or to the rest of his family. And I'm agreed. I'm the same. I'm going to be taking the Novavax very, very shortly, now that it's actually available, but it wasn't available at the time. And I wasn't happy when I looked at the safety qualifications of how the steps have been fast-tracked by Donald Trump, by the way. Let's not forget that to begin with at all. It was his administration. And I wanted to hold out to the Novavax, and which is basically it's a traditional vaccine, and one that doesn't use new technology, which actually has, no one's ever experimented on this type of technology before, and so we literally do not know what the long-term consequences could be, and because it is a genetic organism, or to be defined very carefully, the environmental EPA, when you look into that particular documentation they've been brought in, they technically don't actually call the nano substance in there or a GMO, but only because it doesn't self-replicate. But they do acknowledge that it's not just an ordinary, out of the normal kind of ingredient you see in vaccines. This is new technology. It hasn't been experimented on. This is why it was classified as provisional in the documents. It literally says, don't know, so we're going to, and the original law that was set up for, it was designed to be only for small groups of people that were in drug trials, which, when that was tested in court and found to be the case, the government responded by simply changing the law. So we decided not to go down that particular road, and that was the beginning of my trip. And at that particular point, I was down in Bluff, so I went to this protest, and the first thing that occurred to me was the fact that there was one flag saying something about trannies and Donald Trump, and there was a rattlesnake. And yes, so that component was there, but versus the let me put it this way, we had rainbow couples there, so they kind of counted up the Donald Trump category. There were representations there from three separate iwi and multiple hapu. There was an Indian woman, there was an Asian, there was actually a very diverse bunch of people from all walks of life, normal people who didn't have three heads. And So that was my first experience of the disconnection between what I was seeing kind of being reported in the media and what I actually encountered in person. And bear in mind that Southland actually is a relatively conservative environment, and so you would expect to meet sort of certain type of farming types, and they were there. But generally speaking, they were way much more tolerant than again that we were being presented in the media was the case. The second thing that kind of got me about the situation was that when we went to that protest was the fact that the media would turn around and they were walking around with their notebooks shut. Now, to me, as a journalist, when you're walking around talking to people with your notebook shut, it's normally because you've already got the story written in your head, and you're really just there to kind of capture a few little, quotes that fit the story that you've already written. So that was a confirmation to me of the fact that what was being approached and what was being rebroadcast was being done so with a specific kind of attitude and narrative presented. Now, this doesn't actually surprise me this much. I've dealt with the Southern Times on numerous occasions. The TY Point has been a classic example where the coverage started off by basically denying that there was an issue to eventually downplaying it, while the economic representations of larger corporations that were present in TY seemed to get much more preference and leeway than the fact that, literally, there's hundreds of thousands and tons of toxic waste that's very, very lethal, and that they've been breaking the rules left, right, and centre for decades. That got basically very little coverage by the Southern Times, and only much later on, when independent journalists actually had broken the story open, did the Southern Times start to make that a regular feature. So I wasn't surprised to get that kind of response. And when we turned around, I left Bluff. The next sort of my trip to Wellington would be basically, again, deciding to participate in the Convoy 2022, which was the set up by Jess Hudson from Invercargill originally. She then proceeded to have problems because the social media page in the North Island was being controlled by components that were linked to Counterspin. Now, Counterspin, for those who don't know, is set up by a chap, a former national white supremacist, Kelvin Alps, who's not only, he's a strange character, Kelvin, because he runs around funding the sort of right-wing groups, but he's also running around trying to basically stir up, I think it was about 2016, him and this thing called the Aotearoa Intervention Force went into bank owners' were a bank manager's house, and basically sort of insinuated that the BNZ or the manager had to, hadn't played fair with one of the clients because of something to do with Maori sovereignty. So he's sort of playing both sides of the field, and he's also got very strong mining connections, and he's also got very strong US intelligence community connections, which are those three things don't ever get mentioned about Calvin. That he's also funding the Maori sovereignty movement, which is far left. That he has these mining connections, and that he has these American intelligence connections, only that he's basically outright. And that's the only thing that they kind of do mention when they talk about Calvin Alps in the media, while they downplay these other components, which I think is quite strange, because you have a person here that's clearly been driven by outside interests, whose primary situation seems to be actually destabilising. It's not necessarily he's outright per se, because he has literally said he's funding far left groups. He's also can be found funding far right groups. Pretty much the kind of reaction to most of the people that met in the protests who are kind of encountering this is the kind of classic QAnon misinformation that the media like to go, oh, this is what these people believe on. Now, a lot of the stuff that Kelvin peddled, who's not a professional journalist and really doesn't know what he's doing, but gets the stuff put on the Stephen Bannon network, who's the guy that actually funds Donald Trump. But most of basically the protesters that I was encountering were like, well, no, we don't feel really good about this guy. There's something not quite right. But they had a very large presence in the protest camp, largely because it says, Kelvin Alps comes with deep pockets, which those deep pockets have never really drawn the curiosity of our national media when they focus on this particular issue, which I think is quite interesting, because I do think there's actually a much bigger script going on here. But basically, from that viewpoint of that carbon dioxide kind of that component, I found myself kind of going, no, don't want to, be involved in the convoy situation because it's going to be this sort of kind of QAnon Trumpy thing, blah blah blah. But I went along again, just I wanted to see actually what the response was going to be like, and I wanted to see how it was going to be reported on, and I wanted to see what the people like themselves. Other words, do my job as a journalist, actually go and investigate these things. Now, I turn up on the Saturday morning, and there were 200 or 300 vehicles to begin with, and my kind of response was, well, okay, that got more people turn out than I actually thought it was. There's a few more freaks out there than I was led to believe. And they did a great job. They provided food for the people that turned up and then coffee. And again, I'm always interested in the finance of where some of the finance came from, because again, there was 60,000 actual meals put through Parliament. We'll come back to that issue, I think, in the third show. So turned up, and it was a great vibe. And again, there were a few signs which were of the Trump QAnon nature. There were quite a few signs directed at Cindy herself, which again, there seems to be this sort of idea that a protest and saying being taking the leader in charge and not being necessarily polite and deferential is like unique just to Jacinda. I don't think that's an actual truth at all, because I actually remember very distinctly at the TPA protest that I participated in and covered that. Again, there were plenty of signs, and there always has been. I mean, all the way back to the nuclear-free period, and before that with Robert Muldoon and Piggy Muldoon getting a fair slapping as well. So, it was pretty much when you turn up to protests in terms of the signs, what you see, and there was nothing incredibly offensive or insulting. It was actually pretty, I won't say mainstream, but it was pretty kind of like typical what you expect of a New Zealand-based protest. And it had a very warm, friendly vibe. Again, which contrasted against this whole scene that in both scenes that the protesters were meant to be violent, angry agitators. Again, in Southland, this was sort of the image that was going to get presented. How it was likely to be, in the protest, what it was going to be like, but actually it wasn't. It wasn't the case at all. And at one point, I actually walked over to, there was a gentleman there with a very large telescopic camera that was very keen on taking photographs of every protester there. These violent, evil protesters, and I walked over and basically got the number of this photographer who was actually a policeman and I believe an inspector. And not from Southland. The local Southland cops were actually were very, very decent the whole way through, and were kind of quite honest that they'd rather be somewhere else, and thought the whole thing was typically the government, going over the top and just wasting everybody's time to make to make their own kind of almost protests in a way, using taxpayers' dollars in the form of police to stand up and try and get some numbers to provide some menace to something that the protesters were failing to bring to the protests themselves. So I walked over to this gentleman, and proceeded to ask him about the protest and say, look, you've got a job to do, but do you mind asking a few questions? And again, it came out of this police officer's mouth a single focus. He'd focused on the guy with a flag with a rattlesnake on it, and he's seeing that one person is representing everybody at the protest, and he actually wasn't actually from Southland. He was a Wellington police officer, so he was projecting onto the whole protest via one person, which would be written up in his reports and no doubt go back up to his bosses, and they would then use that to ask for more riot shields and tear gas and so on for next year's budget, no doubt. So the response, and then the other interesting aspect about that thing, which I forgot to mention about Southland as well, is that at one point, the only thing we also saw was that they had a free mic policy where they were letting people come up and say things at the microphone. And again, pretty elegant speakers. Most people, to the point, knew why they were there. There was the one person I saw flying the flag. Their child came up and said something which made me grimace and crimage and wish that the earth would open up and swallow them. But they were the exception to the rule. And at one point, however, the gentleman came forward and he went to take the mic. And the MC controllers were being very, very, switched on and paying attention. So in this case, was the only time they wouldn't give the microphone to the protester. And I say protest in inverted comments because as soon as he walked away and realised he wasn't going to get to speak, he walked completely away from the protesters, past the police officers that he signalled to, like waving his hand underneath his throat, indicating that no, he couldn't get the mic. So it was clear that actually he had something to do with the police, and it looked like to me, and I can't be certain because we didn't see how it played out, but it looked like to me as if the protester was going to get up and speak and say something on the mic that would either cause some form of some violent, say, vitriol, or cause something that the media around standing around could then turn around, actually write and report. One other thing I should also mention about that protest is that one of the people that was turning around and taking the photographs of the protesters actually that particular day actually wasn't a protester at all. Police officer. He was actually from Rocket Lab. I still to this day don't know why Rocket Lab felt the need, it was important to go running around taking photographs of the protesters, but we found that actually out later on. Back to Wellington, Christchurch. So in Christchurch, we went along up to Christchurch, and the protesters didn't have three heads. They were, having flags that were what you'd expect of a normal protest. But what really got me was that in every single town that we went to, from Christchurch up to Kaikoura, which is when I turned around and had to go back to Christchurch, and I wouldn't get up to Wellington face for the following week. But what struck me was that in every single town, large numbers of people came out to greet us. And I've always maintained in my reporting, online, in print, on radio, wherever, there is a component within this protest, or the people that are opposed to the vaccine mandate, that have a political agenda. They're either trying to get into politics, or they've been funded by something or somebody wanting to create some form of destabilisation. And I don't think it really matters too much. It's the COVID protests or whatever. There's some right-leaning group sees an agenda in creating a groundswell, which they could see themselves getting into Parliament. It does exist in the component, but it is proportionally what I was seeing in that original Christchurch to Kaikoura response was organic and actually the response of Kiwis going, we're not happy with these mandates. We're not happy with the way that that's being treated, and we're not happy with a government that feels like it actually can dictate to us what we can and what we can't do. I'll also point out at this particular point that when I say these things, a couple of things just to give you guys a bit of background information. I'm in agreement with those kind of New Zealanders, and my background is political science. So I believe that if I was to sit down and do a program about the constitutionalism of this current government and the last government for the last 35 years, I would think I could demonstrate quite clearly that they are in actual fact not. Our government is not a legitimate government. It hasn't been for 35 years, since the 1986 Constitutional Act was passed in a way which doesn't actually fit with the Westminster system. And then what it does is it empowers Parliament to be a Parliament alone, have supreme power. Now, it did that with the 1986 Constitutional Act. It did that without a referendum, and it did it without a parliamentary majority. It only did it with the party in power having the majority ruling. So therefore, what they're doing is creating a legal fiction, which is literally what Justice Cook actually called it. So it's subject there to be a constitutional or a legal or judicial review, because literally you have a Privy Council law or a Privy Lord at that time declaring that, saying this is no go, and yet we've sort of just gone, oh well, never mind, she'll be right, mate. And we now in a position today now where we have governments that are making mandates and various other laws, which I don't believe constitutionally they actually have that power. And it's not just the 1986 Constitutional Act, it's also the 2000 Privy Council Act, which again is a case of the government creating a structure or a governmental structure without actually following the protocols that a Westminster government system is actually designed. Those two things completely basically mean that we've got government that are doing overreach, on numerous issues, and it's an issue outside of COVID that probably really does need to be addressed. And so far, we're not really having anybody in academia, and certainly no one in the media, really addressing these issues in the way that they should. And they are very, very serious issues, which up until, of course, COVID, it was like, oh, yes, you'll be all right, mate. But then these things came along, and this is why we needed to preemptively sort these issues out beforehand, so you don't create these sort of issues of destabilization and polarization, which is what happens now when you've got a crisis situation. So then, of course, someone went from Christchurch, and we as the day went on, the number of cars that were present became apparently, it became clear that there was more and more of these vehicles out there. So that by the time that we hit Christchurch, there was, hit Kaikoura, there was nearly 1,000 vehicles. So you're looking at nearly probably somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 protesters, which is a significant protest in anybody's book. And the way in which it had been done was, for a country as New Zealand, it was a very spectacular sight to see. Not one reporter actually thought, hey, I'll jump in the vehicle and I'll follow these guys and go around and get their stories and find out what's actually going on. So that was that was a huge statement basically about the inability of the media to actually cover the story in a way that New Zealand wanted it covered. Clearly, the first important issue that this entire protest had revealed was I'd started that morning, and because of what had been sold in the media from the government of how many people were opposed to the mandates, I was surprised when 200 vehicles actually showed up at the beginning of the morning. By the time that there was 1,000 vehicles, which is said was 3,000 protests, it became clear this wasn't actually only a few people that were upset about it, which is what the government had been telling us in these national briefings every day, where the briefings would take place. The Prime Minister would get to decide who asked the questions. The Speaker of the House would declare which journalists were accredited and which, so the whole purpose of the Fourth Estate is to be an independent voice that holds the government to account and questions it and asks hard questions. We've now got a situation where it's quite considered to be quite acceptable for the government to set afternoon press releases where they'll decide who will ask them questions, and even when, of course, those people are safe, they pick their favourites. So then, the number of times that Toval O'Brien has been mentioned as the backdrop for comedian sitcoms because of the fact that Ardern regularly dresses her because she's a nice friendly face. That's where our media is at this particular point. So, as I'm talking to you this, I've got this newspaper article out in front of me, which is in the Christchurch Press, How a Loss of Trust Has Fit Out Divisions. It's by Marion Elliott. She's co-director at the workshop, a research training consultancy organisation, with a background in law, human rights and research and advocacy. Now, co-director at the workshop, a research training consultancy organisation. I mean, that doesn't even tell you anything about who funds this organisation. But anyway, and that's sort of what we're actually at now. We're at the point, and I'll carry into this in a section. But she talks about basically how a loss of trust has fed our divisions. This is the heading of the article. It talks about active citizenship being undermined by online abuse, harassment, hate, particularly of women, colour, queer people with disabilities. So, again, these are the excuses that are rolled out at the moment for social media, for greater restrictions on social media, and not just for social media. If you look at the number of laws passing through the Parliament, there's a number of laws that are in there, which are also designed to counter protesting at sea, which again, it's quite a strange law to be passing, and it's one of those laws which got passed through for Christmas, and no one's really kind of asked what the origins are or what it's about. These are the laws that have been passed at the same time that Chris Whawhawhoi is passing through, still struggling with this hate law, because the problem with Chris Whawhawhoi's hate law is he wants to have a law which turns around and allows government to shut down any form of protest or dissent that it wants. But as soon as they present that, it gets basically even the dumbass mainstream corporate-owned media see right through it, and it's a bridge too far. And they're trying to work out how they can actually sell this hate law bill, which will allow. This is a product of what they call the Christchurch Foundation, which is a think tank that is driven by an ex-politician who's actually a current member of the Privy Council, who's then gone out to the corporate world for funding, received funding from Qatar, who if you remember right now, is currently helping fund the Taliban, who reneged on their promise to allow women to go to schools. Um, Qatar is a member of the Vision 2030, which has got the backing of the United Nations Development Programme. When Helen Clark was the leader of the UNDP, made a deal with Vision 2030 to promote the Vision 2030, which is a plan to help Arabic nations modernize and get things like gender equality and basically bring about democratic reforms. However, using the same sort of tracking technology which was used for COVID, introduced under the pretext of COVID, the Saudi Arabian government used that technology to track the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And when he went and found that he was going into an embassy in Saudi Arabia, the irony is that they could have just waited for him to turn up because he's going into a Saudi building. And when he got there to apply to get travel documents to go back to Saudi Arabia, they chopped up Jamal Khashoggi with a bone saw, specifically brought in so that they could stab him multiple times in the foyer of the embassy and then chop him up into pieces. And these are the people, this is Saudi Arabia, who's one of the people in the Vision 2030, which Jamal Khashoggi's crime was showing that Vision 2030 wasn't actually about all these progressive things that Helen Clark had made it out to be and using to point these 17 points of sustainability under the Agenda 2030 model. It was, in fact, a entrenchment of the status quo, which would allow Arabic nations start becoming developers of smart weapons and bioweapons, and basically entrench the patriarchal, feudal, aristocratic, backwards, repressive, tyrannical, violent regimes that ruled Saudi Arabia, and also have basically via their control of things like Qatar, Al Jazeera. Same sort of regimes in Qatar, using things like Al Jazeera and other voices to basically spread out their basically entrenched viewpoints, which fit nicely with the military-industrial complex, which they've partnered with to make these new smart weapons out of basically goods that we dig out of the ground, which we're told are going to make us clean and green, but in actual fact will rip up the oceans, and we don't seem to think that that's ecologically important, and it gets very little media coverage, along with the fact that the word war is even mentioned in the IPCC document even once. They were the sort of people that would be funding the Christchurch call, along with the Arab Emirates, who also use tracking software to turn around and actually kidnap his two daughters, one at sea using armed commandos, and another one off the streets of London, along with the funders of eBay, who again has become found actually also funding right-wing military-industrial complex and mercenary groups, or right-wing mercenary groups. And we think these are the people that we're okay with, these people funding social, the idea of social media censorship because it's violent and evil and says terrible things against women. When the reality is what it's actually done in the past is it's actually been a useful tool at calling the system and leveling the playing field and actually basically calling the system to account. So that's one of the reasons why that trust has been out there, because there actually are people out there that are talking amongst each other and they're seeing that what's been appearing on the television and what the politicians are saying at their nicely controlled media is not actually what's matching up with the truth on the ground. So this philanthropic funding model, which they suggest will be a way of bringing about trust, actually does the opposite. And at the same time, we look at who else is doing the funding, as we see 450 journalists got laid off during COVID, and only 110 were actually employed, as the government provided $55 million, which it later topped up with $20 million, to media institutions on the understanding that they would use this money to cover topics that the government thought were of interest to the public. Now, if that isn't outright bribing and propaganda and the media can't see it as such, it's another reason why our system's failing, because the institutions which are meant to keep our politicians actually accountable are actually falling over and failing to do their jobs. So that ultimately, my experience was from heading up from starting off at Bluff and going all the way to Christchurch before the following week went all the way up to Wellington. My experience of this was people that were really, really, really not happy with the government having to deal with a media that wasn't even interested in telling the stories in an honest fashion, or attempting to actually present them in any other way other than a poor light. Or that's when they bothered to turn up at all, because as I said, during the whole entire Kaikoura convoy, I didn't see one single journalist turn up that day. And so when they start to turn around and say, well, why all these people the shouting at us and being aggressive towards the media. Well, harden the expletive up. That's what being a journalist is about. You're not there to make friends. You are there to ask difficult, awkward questions. Now, and number two is there is a very reason why the public don't actually have any trust in the media, because you can't be trusted to do your jobs properly anymore in a biased, unimpartial viewpoint that doesn't actually reinforce someone else's tech narrative or the politicians of which they buy. Sorry. Next week, part 3, Wellington, we'll get into that, and I'll tell you my experience of the Battle of Portaloo, and who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. And we'll leave it till that point. But we're going to go out today with the appropriately song Convoy.